Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our second Dean's Lecture for 2018. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Julie McLeod, and I'm a professor here in the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. Before we begin, I would like to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of this land on which we meet today. I pay respect to the elders, both past, present, of the Kulin Nation, and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present. Our Dean, Dr. Jim Waterston, was unable to be here tonight and sends his apologies. I was delighted when he asked me or invited me to be an MC for this evening's lecture. It's a topic very close to my own heart, and it's my pleasure to be introducing very shortly Professor Meg Mcguire, who is going to deliver the second Dean's Lecture of this year on how do teachers resist policy they disagree with, which, as you'll agree, is a very pressing topic. Professor Mcguire first started her career in education as a teacher, then became a deputy principal and then an acting principal before becoming a senior lecturer in education at St Mary's College in Strawberry Hill, London. She has since held posts for over 20 years at King's College in London, where she has progressed from being a lecturer to senior lecturer, and most recently, the Professor of Sociology and Education. Professor Mcguire is an internationally renowned education expert with an impressive track record in the sociology of education, education policy, and urban education. She is lead editor of the internationally recognised high-impact Journal of Education Policy and has an outstanding reputation for her school-based sociological and policy research. And her own work has had quite a lot of influence on scholars working here in Australia. Professor Mcguire, together with leading education policy expert Stephen Ball and Dr. Annette Brown, has conducted field-defining research in an Economic and Social Research Council, or ESRC-funded project called Policy Enactments in the Secondary School, Theory and Practice. Professor Mcguire has also conducted ESRC-funded research into the experiences of minority ethnic trainee teachers, post-compulsory transitions, and multi-agency policy in challenging school exclusion in urban primary schools. So we can see how her interests span a lot of topics that are directly relevant to our own education system and experiences. As you can tell, Professor Mcguire's impressive career and research that she has had a long-standing interest in the lives of teachers and has explored issues of class, race, gender and age in teachers' social and professional worlds. Dr. Jessica Gerard is a senior lecturer in education, equity and politics, and at the end of the lecture, Jessica will move a vote of thanks. Thank you, Jess, for agreeing to do this and for organising Meg's visit. Meg has come out to Australia on a University of Melbourne Diocesan Fellowship and has been undertaking a lot of great things while she's here. Today, many of us participated in an all-day symposium on public policy and schooling, and that was a really terrific success, and thanks for your contributions, both Jess for organising that and Meg. And on Thursday, Meg will be meeting with some of our doctoral students for some roundtable discussions. So we're really getting you to work while you're here. So it is our pleasure to have Professor Mcguire here to present tonight's Dean's Lecture on how do teachers resist policy they disagree with. An English research project examines troubling compliance, discomforts, oppositions, refusals and resistance. Please give Meg a warm welcome.
First of all, I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight. It's getting close to the holidays and you've got other commitments and a lot of people are going to be awfully tired at this point in the term. I really appreciate the fact that you've come out in the evening to hear me, and I hope it's going to be a useful use of your time. But as I say, thank you very much indeed to start off with. This presentation draws on a project, as Julie has already said, called Policy Enactments in the Secondary School, Theory and Practice. And it was concerned with the diverse, complex ways in which sets of education policies were being made sense of, were being mediated, and importantly, being struggled over and sometimes ignored in schools. In the process of doing this research, we presented aspects of the work at conferences and seminars, and one question kept reoccurring in nearly every session. And this is the question: was there any evidence of acts of resistance to the various policies that were being enacted in schools? Or were teachers just compliant? Were they just doing it with the policies that they were faced with? And many of our questioners in the presentations that we made spoke of incidents of challenge and resistance that they'd found in their own research or in their own schools, and they were very sceptical about our limited findings in this area. Many people seemed to want us to detail some account of a Foucauldian great refusal where all the teachers rose up and said no, and they were disappointed when we weren't able to produce this. We'd found some evidence of opposition to policies, but not that much. We identified these as discontents, murmurings, indifferences and disengagements, what Goffman calls role distancing. That is, a disdainful detachment of the performance from a role that they're performing. So they didn't like it, but they still did it. So in this presentation this evening, I want to reconsider the arguments about oppositional relations to policy in our four-step case study schools. And opposition may not be the right word or concept either. And I certainly don't intend to suggest a single or simple relationship between commitment and practice. Discomforts may more accurately describe teachers' responses to navigating policies with which they are in some disagreement, but with which they have to comply. So I want to start with a brief consideration of some of the complexities in theorizing resistance and resistance theory in relationship to the work of teachers. Then I want to turn to the perspectives and experiences of one category of policy actors that we identified as critics, those who monitor and critique management techniques or who maintain counter-discourses in schools. In the project, union representatives, reps, fell into this category. Their involvement in workplace organising and the defence of public education makes them especially well placed to provide accounts of discomforts, oppositions, resistances taking place in their schools. And this presentation will explore their experiences and actions. And then finally, I return to a discussion of teacher resistance in schools, and I argue for the need for a more complex lexicon that traces the ambivalences and ambiguities that are involved in teachers enacting and opposing education policy. So to start off with, what do we mean by resistance? What does the literature say? Vinthhagen and Johansson explained that besides agreeing that resistance is oppositional activity, the literature on resistance differs in the meanings of the concept, at the same time as the theoretical understandings and empirical scope varies tremendously. For example, in settings where there are overt attempts to destabilize and replace oppressive state regimes and challenge state brutality, the Arab Spring uprisings, for example, or to challenge capitalism's global hegemony, the Greek revolts against austerity, resistances take the form of activist and collective attempts at change where violence and death can be experienced by subalterns. And in these strong forms of resistance, what's involved is conscious political and directed action. So that's one way of looking at resistance. Yet this doesn't mean that less politicized and less overt attempts to act back against oppressive actions are not resistances too. As Bell Hooks and West have detailed, resistances can be thick and thin. Thick resistances challenge major structures, and thin resistances are typically located in the more everyday micro-political interactions. And so perspectives that begin with a view of power as dispersed and persuasive are particularly helpful for making sense of thin or everyday resistances, according to Foucault. This involves a refocusing of the analysis of power from will and might, the great machineries of power, to circulation and relations, from the sovereign and the state to what Foucault calls the delicate mechanisms of power that work in and through apparatuses of knowledge and truth, from law to normalization, all of which is founded on a recognition that power itself has a history. Thus, alongside macro-political forms of resistance, what Barber terms a spectacular form, an additional strand of resistance studies has documented the ways in which the subaltern speaks back to power in less obvious and direct ways, thin forms of resistance. Choyi talks of sets of practices imbued with a logic that transforms them into sets of resistances. And Vinthagen and Johansson say these practices can include the use of humour. However, Giroux would argue that we've got to be careful because not all oppositional behaviour is resistance, and some oppositional behaviour may in practice have oppressive outcomes. So in our school-based work, in the meetings that we attended, we all know what teachers are like, and humour was regularly evident. Teachers were sarcastic, sceptical, and sometimes bemused and flabbergasted by aspects of policy reforms that were being mandated by central government, or concocted by their own senior management. But do these emotional responses constitute resistance? Or at least a mild form of resistance within forms of accommodation, particularly in relation to those policies that are mandated, that have to be done. Now, the term everyday resistance was introduced some time ago by Scott to explain tactics that people use to survive and undermine repressive domination, particularly in contexts where overt rebellion is risky. Scott talks about disguised forms of struggle amid overt compliance in the form of local resistances that cover its tracks. He gives examples like foot dragging. You know, they ask you to do something, you do it slowly or you do it late. Avoidance, passivity, the sorts of things that teachers are very good at doing. What Scott calls calculated conformity. Now, it could be argued that taking such an inclusive approach to resistance dilutes the meaning of resistance and underplays the distinctive significance of more strategic and focused forms of oppositional action. And I'm dying to find out what has happened with the early years activists who've been on strike today across Australia. But Giroux would say that if we take this resistance, foot dragging, avoidance, arguably within this conceptualization, almost everything becomes resistance. And on the other hand, one benefit is that this wider conception allows for more recognition of the contingent and complex nature of how it is teachers experience, attempt to deal with, sometimes subvert aspects of the contemporary policy landscape that they encounter in their everyday lives. So in trying to detail instances of discomfort, unease and resistance in our school-based study, there were and are at least two key problems. And one is how to recognise these instances in the field. Personal unease is not always evident to or shared with researchers, or even between teachers themselves. Younger teachers may feel that they can't speak to older people about their concerns and vice versa. You know, I'm using age, but there are other axes of difference that may come into play. There are, however, moments of disquiet, refusals, and rage, perhaps, that contribute towards an opening up of spaces of doubt, as Ball and Almeida say, that do become more evident. Another problem lies in classifying what is and isn't resistance, and this is really what I'm talking about here, And Ball talks about how refusal operates as an important form of everyday resistance. Through drawing on written testimonies of different teachers who emailed him with their concerns, he illustrates the ways that they engage in transgressive acts of refusing to be those teachers that are being imagined in neoliberal regimes of high-stakes accountability regimes and rigorous public scrutiny. As Ball argues, the individual is the site of power, where it's enacted or resisted, refused, but never in an absolute sense, rather within what he calls multiple skirmishes. The issue is one of a recognition of and engagement with relations of power. So perhaps the use of humour and other emotional responses are struggles against and refusals of the dominant forms of the teacher that's inscribed in policy. It may also be the case, as Connell argues, that in a context where accountability and performance demands are driven so powerfully by external forces, there may be far less scope for large-scale forms of critique and opposition. And thus, in the light of trying to rethink what we mean by resistance and resistance theories, we've taken another look at our interviews with one key set of policy actors, the teacher union representatives, in order to think again about the unease, discomforts, and any oppositional relations to policy in our schools. Our study was set in 4 co-educational, non-denominational and non-selective secondary schools, selected for their ordinary profiles. For example, in relation to league tables, they weren't performing at the top or at the bottom. They were schools in the middle who had to watch things and had to pay attention. They're very interesting schools to do research in. And the sample included Atwood School, a community school in central London, 2 schools in suburban education authorities, George Eliot and Wesley, and Campion School, which was located in a small county town. These are all pseudonyms, and the names of our respondents are pseudonyms. Over the 2.5-year period of the project's duration, we collected documentary evidence, we observed training sessions, briefings where policy was disseminated and reworked. We conducted 95 semi-structured interviews with heads, senior leaders, class teachers, union reps, support staff, advisory staff. And in analysing this large data set, we've drawn a range of theoretical resources, including Foucault's work on discourse and governmentality, some actor network theory, policy analysis, and the work of Jim Spillane on teachers' sense-making. So overall, we approached the data on the basis that individuals bring their own experiences, skepticisms and critiques to bear on what they see, read, are exposed to. And they'll read policies from positions of their identities and subjectivities. Now, tonight I'm returning to 4 in-depth interviews with the union reps conducted in each school, as we would realistically be able to gather more accounts of any oppositional activity from these teachers. Now, not all resistance comes courtesy of the union, but it's a good place to start. We'd used semi-structured interview techniques to ensure that we covered our major concerns about how policies were being enacted, while allowing spaces for participant insights and observation. We asked the reps about their work as subject teachers as well as union reps, about what they saw as policy imperatives, what they thought the teachers in their school were concerned about and were raising with them in their role as union reps. We returned to the reps' interview transcripts using a system of open coding to reconsider and reanalyse their accounts, specifically from the perspectives of tracing out any discomforts or other responses to policy work in their schools. I'm going to contextualise a little bit now about trade unionism in English schools. There are a number of different unions and professional associations, and that's quite a distinction, the difference between the two, that represent the interests of organised teachers and principals, head teachers. In secondary schools, when we were collecting data, the unions with the largest memberships were the NUT, the National Union of Teachers, the National Association of Schoolmasters and Union of Women Teachers, and the Association of Teachers and Lecturers. The NUT and the ATL merged to form the NEU in September of last year, so it's the biggest union in the country. There are other smaller unions and associations that have very low membership rates and density in schools. Teachers tend to join unions in their pre-service training. It's free, and unions come in and talk to teachers in service. They sometimes join a union in their first school, Sometimes they'll join a union when things go wrong in their careers. Some trainee teachers join unions because they feel that they need to participate in collective action to protect teachers' pay and conditions and defend public education. Now, although there has been some overall decline in trade union membership in England, many public sector workers in health, social service, civil service, education still see trade unionism as part of their organisational and workforce culture. Government statistics reveal that more than 60% of public sector workers belong to a trade union. It's even higher for teachers. One NFER study found that 97% of teachers surveyed belong to a union. And in our 4 schools, the reps detailed high levels of membership, reporting that between 70 and 80% of all their colleagues were union members. And in each of our 4 schools, while some members weren't active and didn't go to union meetings on a regular basis, all the reps could count on a small core of activists who would pass information around very quickly at the department level. So members were kept up to speed with trade union developments. And these networks ensured that the union reps were kept aware of tensions or any emerging conflicts in different parts of their school. So we wondered how the union reps saw their role and the role of unions. They all had similar views. They saw their role as fulfilling the need for representation and advocacy on behalf of the relatively powerless with the relatively powerful, at least in schools, and more, head teachers, and more generally looking after membership and protecting teachers. As Neil said, I think that's the whole purpose of a union, to have a voice through a spokesperson that isn't you. Now, there were differences of opinion about in some schools between the reps and some senior managers. Neil said, he'd had a confrontation with it was actually the deputy head teacher who was angry with me because I sent round an email asking what people thought about something, and she didn't think that was the way the union should be run. She felt I was stirring up trouble rather than waiting for people to come to me, but I thought it was the only way to gauge what was going on. 3 of the reps said that they were sometimes frightened to raise, that members were sometimes frightened to raise concerns or to register their unwillingness to enact policies. What Stuart said encapsulates these disquiets. People keep their gobs shut and they hope that either things will go away or things will get sorted out, or they think it's just me, and if I make a fuss, I'll cause problems for myself. Sometimes they represented individuals in meetings dealing with specific issues. Other times they advocated for wider systemic changes that would make life more manageable for their members. And Dave says, I don't think people like to be seen making waves. And as a union rep, you take that on board, but you have a position which is protected. It's understood you're going to be the person who comes with difficulties. But I suppose we do encourage the idea that collectively, if there's a problem, we want to know about it so we can go along collectively and sort it out. Going beyond working as teacher advocates and taking a lead and being proactive about school-specific issues, the reps also see their role as organising and building campaigns that link to national union campaigns to improve the working conditions of teachers and in challenging policies and practices that they see as damaging to state education. They can, in addition, play a critical role in educating teachers about the need to defend their interests. Neil argued that while some teachers didn't respond well to questionnaires from the head or senior managers, he found it useful to do quick surveys to make sure he knew what was going on, and then he could speak on behalf of people. And this was the case in all of our 4 schools. By using evidence of opposition to changes that were being proposed, reps were sometimes able to preempt and curtail policy reforms before they were rolled out. And this preemptive action can function to damp down more overt forms of resistance. So if you're doing research and somebody's been doing this, you may not know what's actually been going on. So as Stuart said, we're not going to do learning conversations. I put a questionnaire out and I said, do you understand them? Do you understand what they're about? Do you have enough time? And people say, they're a good idea, but they didn't have the time. It's about getting the resources to do this properly. Now, as a result of this opposition, Atwood School's senior management decided not to enact this policy, and thus any potential discomfort or conflict was displaced. And what we see here is a smart way of not complying with an initiative that would add more work while seemingly approving of the policy itself, a form of resistance within accommodation and a practical way of ensuring that teachers don't become overloaded with delivering policies that aren't mandated by government, but that are being proposed by senior managers in their schools. In terms of issues, oppositions and resistances, union reps are generally in a good position to comment on the concerns of their members. And the reps reported that individual teachers did discuss difficulties with them, and doing individual casework can take up a lot of time. And all of the reps reported that it was important to do this, not just to look after people, but pragmatically in terms of holding on to the membership. The reps attend staff meetings as a subject teacher, but also as a union rep, and they're aware of the decisions and changes and choices being considered by senior managers. They can challenge decisions in public forums like staff meetings, and they may be expected to do this by their colleagues. They're expected to make interventions. They're expected to know what the union view is and what the union position is, having been briefed by the national leadership about policy reforms. But as I keep saying, not all oppositional behaviour constitutes resistance, particularly if resistance is taken as having what Giroux calls a revealing function, one that contains a critique of domination and provides theoretical opportunities for self-reflection and for struggle in the interests of self-emancipation. Perhaps only a few of the concerns that members raise will generate this revealing function. However, the sorts of everyday thin resistances, such as the deflection of the learning conversations, are part of the strategic skirmishes and forms of transgression, refusals, and critiques about policy that do go on in schools. Now, from what they told us, we've grouped the union reps' issues into three categories, but this is a heuristic device to start to think about in-school issues. In practice, these concerns and issues of resistance overlap and are interwoven. So first we identified a set of low-level issues of the kind that are problems in most schools at some time. This is disputes about who gets what room or timetabling slots, who gets Friday afternoon, and is it always RE who gets the last, etc., etc. And micro-politics of many schools that can often be managed away or negotiated away. And these points of struggle and conflict don't usually constitute resistance in Giroux's sense of the term, although they can escalate into points of opposition that have a revealing function and involve more people. The second cluster that the reps identified related to in-school management, which tended to call up more oppositional stances in staff rooms. Some of these concerns overlap with the more mundane things, but dimensions of the second cluster, such as the demands of performance management, issues of bullying, heavy workloads, will often resonate with teachers in other schools as they're structural, part of the assemblage of neoliberal managerial school policies that are currently bearing down and reworking state schools as workplaces, as Connell says. It's in this second cluster that resistance, in Giroux's sense, may be more directly constructed and circulated. For example, Neil talked about calendar issues where teachers were expected to do additional assessment-related work in a short period of time. This is an instance where people will just get on and do the job because it has to be done. However, if these sorts of conditions and expectations aren't managed, these concerns on the part of teacher can escalate, and teachers will then withdraw their goodwill. And without which no school can function efficiently or effectively. The withdrawal of goodwill, where teachers threaten to work to rule, are examples of popular practices of oppositional behaviour, but are forms of resistance within accommodation. There is no strike, there is no overt uprising. In contrast, these actions demonstrate the way in which power relations work out in practice, in the spheres in which they operate, as the process which, through ceaseless struggles and confrontations, transforms, strengthens, or reverses them, as Foucault would say. And in the third cluster, we've grouped concerns that potentially have a wider socio-political reach, such as proposed cuts to the state education budget and loss of jobs. And here it might be expected that the teacher unions would unite to mount a defence of public education at a national level. According to Giroux, whether any actions are classified as opposition or more overt resistance will depend on the degree to which the action contains the possibility of galvanizing collective political struggle round the issues of power and social determination. And this may be better gauged over an extended period of time. The struggles over the provision for decent state schooling are certainly not over in your country or in mine, and to borrow from Williams, may be more accurately seen as part of a longer revolution. All the four reps talked about the ways in which schools are under almost constant pressure to perform. Schools have to collect data, track student progress. This data is then used to audit the student, the teacher, and the school performance. This policy imperative is fed down to the school, onto the head teachers and principals, through the senior leaders and into the classrooms. And the pressure being experienced in schools is the result of policies informed by the ideology of deliverology. These pressures are also, in some instances, mediated by the vision and ambitions of individual teachers. As Stuart says, we're under the pressure of central government, but we're also under the influence of members of the management team who have their own visions about what they want to do and who are trying to implement whatever vision Ken has or whatever things they want to do. So we're at the mercy of all of these. It's not just macro policies, it's what's going on in our school. And the pressure to perform seeps into the very fabric of social relations in schools in ways that function to remake and rework teacher subjectivity. In the high-stakes, pressurized environment of contemporary schooling, what it is to teach is under reconstruction, and what schools are and do is called into question. From what our reps reported, it was evident that some senior managers attempting to enact contentious and high-stakes policies were resorting to oppressive ways of exerting their power over the classroom teacher. And so Frank said there's been at least one official complaint about the language she used, the shouting, the hectoring, the disrespectful way in which she spoke to a teacher. I've had people who've not wanted to take it any further, but are in tears about the way the head has spoken to them. These sorts of pressures surfaced in debates about what teachers were asked to do, as well as how they were performing. Those teachers who are perturbed or disturbed by performativity demands and accountability measures might be more susceptible to what Tamara Bibi calls the experience of the impossibility of policy ideals and the sheer hard work of living that produce a set of psychic and social costs that can be difficult for teachers to deal with. And in cases like this, refusals can segue into resignations or exits in Hirschman's terms. The reps talked also about wider socio-political concerns. For example, Dave was talking about education cuts to the budget, and in somewhat different veins, Frank and Stuart discussed how, in their view, schools were compounding class-related inequalities of access and attainment through the way they grouped students for teaching and through the pathways and routes that students were being steered towards. I think it's really blatant. All the kids in the bottom classes come from working class families, 2/3 of the kids in the top class from middle class families. It's not so much that nothing's done about it, it's just that the issues are so massive in the sense that until you get rid of the class difference in people's backgrounds, what are you going to do? We can see it. I can see it just looking at those on free school meals, which is our proxy for poverty in the UK. Not that that's a complete indicator of class. They're all being steered off to hairdressing and car mechanics. From our larger set of interviews, few teachers expressed these sorts of concerns directly, although that may well have been because of the questions that we did or did not ask. That does have to be remembered. Neil and Dave shared a similar outlook, but it was Stuart and Frank who spoke unambiguously about class regimes in education policy and provision. They were aware of the contradictions that shape education work and spoke explicitly about the politics of education. It was evident that they felt what Giroux calls an acute sense of betrayal and moral indignation as the social state is dismantled, that reflected a refusal on the part of teachers to divorce education from politics, authority, and matters of social responsibility. Talking about policy work in school, when we asked the union reps about what they were doing in terms of challenging policy. They talked about complexities in terms of assessment technologies and the way students were being grouped. They talked about the outcomes of policies in terms of teachers' conditions, work intensification, and pressure. And they talked about the influential role of senior management and how policies were being interpreted by some teachers. And we were very interested in the ways that the delicate mechanisms of power, Foucault, work in schools and limit refusals and forms of resistances. In all of our 4 schools, people held posts of responsibilities for key individuals, policy enthusiasts we call them, who would drive the translation of certain strands of policy. These posts attract additional salaries and additional non-contact time, less time in the classroom. So key policies in the UK, like behaviour management, assessment, attainment, professional development, become the province of certain individuals who often led teams responsible for making these policies work, for translating text into practice. And these policies were sometimes subject to and mediated by individual enthusiasts. And in Campion's school, Dave recounted the sorts of difficulties that happened. We've had to talk to the head. There was a perception that people on the senior leadership team were developing individual policies rather than collectively. And because each senior manager had been given areas of responsibility, they were taking them a little bit more as just their province. And so people started to feel uneasy and didn't quite know what to do. You'd get a different answer depending on which senior manager you spoke to. And as we have argued, policy work can be taken up and embraced more for its career-enhancing potential than pedagogic potential. And our reps were aware of this version of policy actor work in their school setting. Stuart says, there's a load of them, they're ambitious, they've all got things they want to do. And these initiatives weren't really about helping the kids, they're helping the school. And it's all about putting something on their CV so that they could go for promotion. It's a game that everybody plays. We asked all of our respondents to list policies that they were aware of and that had implications for their work. And we anticipated that the reps would be more critical of current education policy. However, and crucially, it's also the case that responses to questions about policy as well as resistance will differ according to how policy or resistance is being understood and constructed by the person you're talking to. If some practices in schools have become normalised and part of the repertoire of the teacher, they may be less likely to cause discomfort or lead to oppositional activity. And again, Stuart said, well, what do you mean by policy? And he talked about the assessment policy that was in play. And he was saying it's so deeply ingrained that it's a bit too general. I mean, if you were to ask somebody, they wouldn't even know. They wouldn't even see it as a policy. They just see it as what we do. And as Foucault wrote, power relations end by forming comprehensive systems. The logic is perfectly clear, the aim's decipherable, and yet it's often the case that no one is there to have invented them. And what Stuart says, the logic of assessment mindset has become normalised and internalised a regime of truth, although its techniques and tools, the strategies and tactics that surround the accountability culture are regarded as policy work by people like me and you. In terms of oppositional behaviours or antagonisms, it could be that some teachers regard the examinations culture as immutable, a system that is non-negotiable, at least at the local level. Thus, any opposition or resistance is directed towards refining the policy, just making it a little bit better, rather than tackling the central matter of the classification, labelling and dominant discourse of the examination system itself. It doesn't mean, however, that there isn't a refusal of aspects of assessment technology. Now, from our analysis of the reps' interviews, we located a few accounts of instances where oppositions did lead to some union wins in our schools. And Neil gave an example where his own English department had refused to enact a non-compulsory reform, and they went to the head teacher and they explained why they didn't need to do it. And the head eventually changed his mind. But his decision was influenced by the fact that the English department had got very, very good levels of attainment. And so, in a sense, what they were doing was okay, so they were let off the policy hook. As Neil says, he sort of trusts us because we've had good results for a long time. In Dave's school, the staff were able to make little changes and bring pressure to bear. And in these cases, common sense, discussion, and a degree of negotiation produces positive outcomes. So therefore, again, you don't see resistance because this work has gone on in small meetings, in small chats, in strategic discussions around the staff room that then get conveyed back and get dealt with. And these are examples where perhaps teachers sometimes reappropriate dominant discourses to their own ends, arguing that their ideas will be more effective in supporting successful outcomes in schools. Let's do it this way, it's going to be easier for us, but actually it's going to work more better for you as well. But again, the question, are these examples of resistance, of refusals, through the provision of positive alternatives? Or is this just problem solving or micro-political skirmishes and disputes in schools? Neil told us of other occasions when teachers dug their heels in and refused to comply with a last-minute request for a meeting, a request that isn't lawful. You can't call teachers to a meeting without giving them notice, and his head had called them to a meeting. But non-compliance and oppositional behaviour doesn't again necessarily constitute a rejection of the school system or of national policy reform. It may just be a tactic to make life a little bit better. As Neil explained, he tried to make everyone to go to a health and safety meeting that he should have had earlier, and so it's his fault. And we said, no, you can't put a new date in. People have got things to do. So I said, vote with your feet, don't go to the meeting, and no one turned up, so he couldn't have his meeting. And he was annoyed, but that's the law. An account of a stronger challenge was described by Stuart. He gave us an example of collective action that could have led to massive staff changes in the leadership team. Now, we didn't pick this up from any other teachers. He told us about 2 big meetings that had happened with the head, and basically there was a vote of no confidence passed in the senior leadership team. He said it was very strong stuff. I've never seen it before in my life. You know, people may have had little moans and gripes, but I've never seen to the extent of people putting their names to a piece of paper. You know, it takes a lot to get people wound up like that. But he was the only one who told us about that. He highlighted what he saw as a central contradiction between schools as sites of ethics of care and simultaneously hierarchical workplaces that he thought accounted for why teachers might be slower to oppose. He actually said, I think there's a problem with schools. And the problem with schools is different from other organisations. Probably charities are in a similar position, where we're all seen as being on the same side. If you were to work for British Telecom, they know their managers are managers and the workers are workers, the post office and so on. There's a clear class divide, whereas teachers is different because a lot of teachers don't see these class divisions, or not class divisions as such, the power divisions, because we're all friendly and we're all talking about the kids or whatever, but those divisions are still there. So in my presentation, I've revisited the interviews that we conducted with the union reps in our case study schools in order to ask again if there was any resistance to the policy reforms that schools were being charged with putting into practice. And one matter stands out. Many small-scale conflicts that occur as part of the everyday micropolitics of schools can be resolved by in-school negotiations and bargaining and persuading, conducted largely in interaction between the reps, buttressed by large in-school union memberships and their head teachers. Whether or not these instances of opposition can effectively challenge some forms of in-school dominance or some aspects of controversial education reforms is questionable. It may not be possible for there to be full-blown resistance within an individual school setting, although national unions have at key junctures mobilised the membership to fight off some of the worst cuts in public welfare provision or to challenge education policies that they see as unjust or contradictory to good practice. If resistances are in some part about revealing spaces of doubt that may build up into actions for change, then there is a need to return to how power is understood and theorised. If those in position of power are able to take preemptive measures to anticipate and reduce oppositions and challenges before they happen, this will have fundamental consequences for the possibilities and tactics of resistance, particularly in schools where we're all on the same side. We're all there for the kids. We're all the same, as Stuart said. However, power in schools is complex, mediated by different policy actors in and outside schools, and takes a variety of forms. There are forms of power that are asserted in ways that leave little space for negotiation, mandated policies, for example. In response, some school leaders may seek to persuade, to orchestrate consent, and in doing so, avoid confrontation, and sometimes do it to try to buffer their staff. In schools, the management of consent is central to the successful operation of power, the school, while simultaneously eroding teachers' capacity to resist. Teachers can and do build relational forms of power through everyday resistances, humour, foot dragging and the like. In the school setting, teachers do have some channels for negotiation. They can withdraw their goodwill and their labour. They can also resign their posts, which has happened quite a lot in my country. As I've argued here, they do challenge some aspects of the neoliberal teacher's role, a differentiating curriculum, sorting and classifying students, for example. As Stuart says, being a teacher comes with a preformed notional identity of all working together for the good of the students and working for the same assumptive goals. And what this may displace, however, are questions about how schools could be other. So if we were to go back to those conversations with those critics who asked about our limited findings of refusals and oppositions, what would we say now? Quite evidently, it would be important to tease out how resistance, and more properly resistances and oppositions and refusals are understood and theorised. There is a need for a more complex lexicon that traces the ambivalences and ambiguities that are involved in enacting and resisting education policy in schools. And there's also a need to consider contextual specificity with more precision than I have done here this evening. The specific history and culture of schools, specific policies, the specific power dynamics in play, and the degree of capacity for fighting back on mandated policies other than resignation needs a new analysis, a refined and rigorous analysis. Hall and McGinty in the UK have argued that theorising and researching resistance at a time of what they recognise as widespread compliance in teachers in England has become an urgent issue for educational researchers. They add that there's a need to collate and disseminate evidence of what's being undertaken by those who are engaging in activism as a means to challenge the dominant discourses embodied within the neoliberal approaches to education policies. We hope that to a small degree we've added to this evidence base. Thank you very much.
So it's my job to offer a vote of thanks to Professor Meg Mcguire, and I have to say that this is a job that I can do genuinely and unreservedly. In our field of education and in more broadly, we live in a time of significant policy development. And these policies are often presumed to have some sort of kind of linear top-down impact, as if somehow we can easily and unproblematically translate these policies into practice. Professor Mcguire's research work and her lecture here this evening tells us about the need to be attuned to vastly more complex processes of policy change and policy enactment. Meg's work offers insightful provocations to think more deeply about taken-for-granted issues in education and to push further on lines of analysis to reveal far more complex phenomenon. This evening, Professor Mcguire has certainly provided us with a generous serving of food for thought. There are, as Meg's presentation has so expertly highlighted, moments of disruption, moments of dispute, moments of resistance when teachers are faced with policy of change. But these are at times perhaps elusive or a little slippery. Perhaps most importantly, Professor Mcguire indicates a need to understand policy enactment in schools as a site of power, and one in which teachers can and do yield power individually and collectively in their responses. There's a need, Mcguire argues, to engage more thoroughly with the practices of power that underpin policy work in schools and the ways in which this power is exercised and understood. The consideration of the role of trade unions is an important one for us to reflect on in Australia, particularly as Meg has already mentioned, the historic strikes today from early childhood educators, notoriously one of the most underpaid but qualified workforces in their bid to have a very timely 30% increase in pay. Meg's presentation on the complexity of resistance in policy enactment demonstrates the issues around the collective possibility of action are certainly central to any consideration of resistance, and one that points to the agency and power of educators as a collective profession, not just as individual teachers responsible for complying with policy. I was really taken with the term the managing of consent that happens in schools and the forms of compliance that might arise from that. So on that note, I'm sure you will all agree with me that Professor Mcguire's presentation this evening has offered us a timely and important consideration for thinking about the present and future work of teachers and the ways in which policy work is undertaken in schools. So please join me in thanking Meg Mcguire for this evening's Dean's Lecture.